Good afternoon and welcome to the podcast today. I am super excited for our guest today. Besides the fact that he's a good friend, we go back many years, not just many years, but actually multiple companies in terms of working together. I'd like to introduce Frank Ingriselli. And Frank currently is the president of New York Stock Exchange listed Indonesia Energy. And for those of you that are following along on your trading symbols, it's INDO. And I think what you're going to find most interesting, and I'm excited to learn about, is a little bit about the company today, but also his journey, how he landed in this position. I can tell you that for myself, after having worked with, I guess, thousands of CEOs of publicly traded companies over the years, I don't know if I've met somebody like Frank who has been so involved in so many different companies and taken so many companies public. Frank, with that introduction,
Thank
thank you
you.
for joining us today.
Great. Well, thank you, Seth. It's great to be here and tell you a little first about myself and this current company, Indonesia Energy. But, I've had a long journey. I was filling something out on a bio of a company that maybe will be one of the next companies that I'm involved with that's going on to the New York Stock Exchange. But I realized that I've been 49 years in the oil and gas industry. And
Wow.
started in Texaco Inc. But my background, I went to undergraduate, got an MBA, got a law degree in New York, and didn't want to practice law. And I got hired by Texaco Inc. And they said to me, Frank, we want you to be our kind of global representative outside the United States, putting oil and gas deals together. Did that starting in 1979.
Okay.
And spent 23 years at Texaco, had a wonderful, wonderful career. I starting, 1 week after joining Texaco in 1979, they sent me to China.
Wow.
And I lived in China in 1980.
Was that expected when you took the position?
No, I didn't know I'd be going to China, but they told me that, hey, we've got this opening. China's opening up to the international oil industry, and we want to put you on the China project. And I thought, wow, what a great, right out of law school and not practicing law. I was like a deal maker and joining a team of Texaco, and we're 50-50 partners with Chevron, which, by the way, took over Texaco in 2001. But it was just an extraordinary opportunity, and I figured this is going to be really high profile for my career. So I said, absolutely, I'm in. They
How
sent me
long were you in China for?
for a pretty good amount of time. Yeah. So it was exciting then. You go to China, and there weren't too many people that looked like me. Okay, that was a rarity
Got
there.
it.
I've
Got
had
it.
people driving their bicycle, and they're all bicycle. There weren't too many cars on the road. They're driving their bicycle, and they're looking at me and crash into a light post or things like that. I mean, I was real oddity at that time. So, but I spent working on that deal. I spent close to 4 years on that. I lived there in
Wow.
all of 1982 into 1983. I lived for 1 year in Beijing, China.
Did you learn the language? I'm
It
just
was
curious.
exciting. I never learned the language, a little bit. So
Okay.
I spoke a
Okay.
little bit of Chinese, but now I've lost it.
Right.
But we ended up being successful. So we signed the first successful foreign investment in China. The energy sector was offshore. That time, the Chinese wanted to keep what they call the foreign devils offshore, not on their land.
Mm.
So we were offshore drilling. We found oil. It's still producing oil today for Chevron, on behalf of Chevron Texaco. And it was a great kickstart to my career. When we signed the contract, it was in a great hall of the people with the premier of China, and who became notorious in the Tiananmen Square. He's the one who executed the Tiananmen Square incident. And but meeting with him, having a celebration with him, really kickstarted my career. The flying on the corporate jet with the CEO of Texaco and Chevron, and then putting that deal together. So it was interesting, as an aside, what they said to me. Chairman of Texaco said, Frank, we think you're really good in communist countries, so we're going to send you now to the Soviet Union. So
No way.
wow. So I went to the Soviet Union a few years later, but I did go to the Soviet Union, and ultimately I ran a Russian joint venture oil company. I was the CEO of that on behalf of Texaco and Exxon. And it was a great career. 23 years there. I rose to the position of President of Texaco International Operations and Texaco Technology Ventures. So it was a great, great career. But what I tell people, and it's kind of interesting because Indonesia is my fourth startup onto the New York Stock Exchange, IPO.
Okay.
But what was interesting is when I left Texaco, and I left it because Chevron took over in 2001, and I got offered a nice package, change of control, and I grabbed it, took my stock, took my options, cashed it in, did very well with that. And but what was interesting is when I left Texaco, the number one producing asset in the world for Texaco, number one asset was in Indonesia, was our asset in Indonesia. And for
Hmm.
Chevron, their number two largest asset in the world was in Indonesia. And together we were producing 1 million barrels a day, which at today's prices, oil has come down a little bit, but that still would be about 70 to $80 million a day coming out of the ground that we were controlling. And so when I got offered the opportunity to do a startup with Indonesia Energy on nuclear, it was a no-brainer. This was a country that I knew very well and knew we can make this successful. But before that, so I leave Texaco in 2001, did some consulting work in the alternate energy sector,
Okay.
developing batteries for hybrid electric cars for the Prius. We had the patents on that. It was very with solar energy, with wind energy. That's where I was. Now I'm in oil and gas, back into that. But I became very serious in that sector of the industry. Then I decided to do a startup. It was called Pacific Asia Petroleum. It's not there, and it was taken over, brought private. But we did that on the New York Stock Exchange in 2007.
Was that your first foray
First
into
into
running a
starting
public
a public
company?
company. It was very interesting. I'm now in California mainly. I do have an apartment in New York, but I'm here in the San Francisco Bay Area. But so we had our investors were all from the Bay Area starting up that company. So I bought assets back from Chevron that were old Texaco assets and started a company around that. So it was quite interesting,
How did
and we
you
were
how did you
successful.
were you like sell because many of our listeners are startups, many of them are somewhere along that journey to getting to the stock exchange. Um, was it, sort of like a deer in headlights when you took over or that
Oh
approach
boy,
on the public side? How
absolutely.
did you familiarize yourself with the rules,
I
regulations,
know,
shareholder
it
communication?
was so unique because I was used to Texaco where we had a tax department, we had a legal department, we had
Right.
a finance department. And, I can go to those experts there, but now I'm here being like the financial guy, being the tax guy, being the, everything guy. We're a very small company starting a core group of individuals that were actually all ex-Texaco people. And I put a board together with ex-Texaco people, but we had guidance. So I had some lawyers, I had some investment bankers here in California that sort of guided me how this all works. But it was a learning experience.
Right.
Now, if they're the fourth one, you kind of know what's going to happen, and that. But it was really it was an extraordinary learning experience for me. So we did that
Okay.
company in 2008. We raised a bunch of capital as required by a guy who wanted to take us pretty much private. He took 80% of the company, changed the focus of the company. And I left in 2009, I think it was. But we've delivered for those first shareholders. They got about a 10x return on their investment. So
Nice.
it was a good kickstart. So when I started the next company, which was in the shale business, we acquired some shale interests, and that was kind of the shale revolution. 2010 was taking place. And that company is called Pedevco, PED, and that's on the New York Stock Exchange. Still there.
Still
Look it
there.
up. PED, Pedevco. And that came a little bit the same way. We borrowed a lot of money and got into a struggle. We never went bankrupt. We were still kicking off positive cash, but we owed a heck of a lot of money to bankers in New York. And I found a savior, and it was somebody who I did business with at Texaco back in my Texaco days. And he put his own capital and he bought out all the bankers at 10 cents on the dollar they took. And that company is still very successful today. It's earning
Wow.
money, earnings per share. It did really well. So look that company up. I then,
Okay.
at that point, got contacted by some bankers again in New York that said, "Hey, here's this Indonesia Energy. We're doing an IPO on that, and you'd be perfect here with your background of Texaco, but then also these other startups that you did. Be the president of that company and run the public company, really run it, while I'm not the CEO. I'm kind of running the public side of this company in the United
Wow.
States. And so I never looked back from that. We did it December of 2019. We went public. And what was interesting is here's Indonesia. So a little snapshot on Indonesia. It's the fourth largest country in the world in terms of population. I just looked the other day. Now it's actually, I always used to say China, but now actually it's India's number one. China's number two. United States is the third most populated country in the world. Indonesia, number four.
Did
And
not know
then
that.
with the background that, it was my biggest producing asset in the portfolio of Texaco when I left, and Chevron's second biggest, it was kind of a no-brainer to jump into this company and go forward with it. But as big as Indonesia is, this was the first company ever to do an IPO on the New York Stock Exchange from
I
Indonesia.
remember. I remember. I was there with you. I
Yeah,
and
unbelievable.
and here you are 5, 6 years later, and still
Yeah,
chugging along.
yeah. It's amazing.
It's interesting to point out because very often when we've had some CEOs of publicly traded companies on the podcast, very often it's like somebody who had this light bulb moment and they started a company,
Yeah,
they launched it out of their garage or
yeah,
their parents' basement.
yeah.
Um, but you have taken a route that I think is or should be inspiring to a lot of people, which is, you can be an executive and if you do it right and you develop a network and a reputation,
Yeah.
it seems like they came to you. They're like, we want
Yeah.
you to get involved. You didn't
That's
have
how
to.
it is. So it was very
Yeah.
interesting. The relationships you developed from the first two public companies, these bankers now knew what I did, and they said, "Hey, we think Frank would be a great." They introduced me to the two founders, these two guys, and I know Seth, you've met them. We were at a conference in Atlantic
Right.
City
Yeah. Of
one
all
time, and
places.
you met those
Right.
guys. Too young. So when I met them, now I think they're maybe pushing 40, but they were in their mid 30s. They put $40 million of their own money to start up this Indonesia Energy company. And
Do you have to travel frequently? Do you go
not
there
too
or?
much. In the beginning, I did, but what happened was here we are, December of 19, doing our IPO. And what happens in February, that's when we rang the opening bell in February on Valentine's Day of all the days.
Oh wow.
The opening bell. And then like right after that, COVID started. And
Uh-huh.
so we got sort of precluded from me going over there. It stopped some of the work. We were trying to drill some wells. We were precluded from doing that because flights within Indonesia was complicated. And so it kind of put us on some breaks for a few years. But then we got out of that. But yeah, I do get there. Their team comes here quite a bit. And but I love going there. I was just talking to the principal, the founders today about
Wow.
going there next month. I think I'll be going back out there and looking at.
I'm curious. I'm going to show my ignorance here. I once in a while when I'm on the treadmill, I need something to watch. So I came across this. I think it's a Netflix show called Landman. I don't know if you've heard of
Oh,
it, but it's
I
all
know
about
that.
the oil and gas.
Yeah,
And I'm not going to get into the
yeah,
show itself, but I
yeah,
guess based on what that portrays, but also based on what you're saying, it sounds
yeah.
like it's a really tight-knit industry. Like you got to know the right people. Like if I
You
if
do.
I if I popped up today, out of Woodmere, New York, and say, "Hey, I want to get into the oil and gas business,"
Yeah,
you got to know the right people. Is that is
you
that an
do.
accurate?
Exactly. Yeah, I like that show. It was nice to watch that. It's a pretty wild show.
Yeah,
We didn't quite have some of the excitement they have from people who,
good.
pulling a hood over my head and
Right,
trying
right,
to kill me or, a wife like he has in that show or
right,
anything
right.
like that. It's a pretty wild and crazy show, but very entertaining. But yeah, but it does hit the point of, you got to know who you're dealing with. You get to know
Right.
the people in the industry. And I got to know the people kind of more in the international industry because that's where I was well, all of my career at Texaco was always international. But post Texaco, I did some of these domestic startups. But with Indonesia, it was just been a great experience working with these gentlemen and working with the team there. And you're dealing in a country again that, is right now, it's the largest country in Southeast Asia.
Mm.
It's the 10th largest economy in the world. It's got a GDP for the last decade has been running at a GDP growth of over 5%. So their demand for energy is growing and growing and growing. They used to be, when we were producing at Texaco there, they were an exporter of oil, but those fields after Texaco and Chevron produced for 50 years there. By the way, produced 13 billion barrels of oil, $1 trillion in cash flow out of Indonesia, Texaco, and Chevron. But those production rates came way down. The country needs more oil because of its high growth rate. And so it's got to import. And so they gave a lot of good incentives, especially to their own. So we're a domestic company in Indonesia. So we get some advantages. But every country in the world, every company, all the major companies in the world are operating in Indonesia. There's a chart. I encourage people go to our website, indo-energy.com. You can see on our presentation, there's a slide there that shows the logos of like every major company in the world that's operating in Indonesia, which is made up of islands and big offshore operations. We're all onshore. But
I'm curious, Frank, because I guess to some extent you've got to certainly know the industry, right? If the oil is there and drilling is going well, but it seems like you must have perfected the intangible element of culture, right? I mean, you were in China for a couple of years, you were in Russia, Indonesia. There's sensitivity to culture or knowing how to
that's a
leverage
good.
that's got to come into play.
That's a great question. So when people ask me, how were you successful at Texaco? How did you bring some of those projects in China and then in the Soviet Union, Russia, to fruition and successful on those? Even though Russia, a lot of them aren't as successful anymore, but when I put it together, it was. But it's understanding the culture. It's relating to the culture. So I found myself when I was in China putting that deal together, when we had some controversial clauses, I listened to what the Chinese told me their concerns were, why they needed that. And then my role was to go back to the board of Texaco and say, listen, this is important to them and this is why. And this is culturally important to them. I had to be sort of like that bridge. I was kind of negotiating for the Chinese in front of the Texaco board because I needed, we weren't going to get everything we wanted. It was kind of a frontier opportunity for the company, Texaco. So, and that's what I found. Same thing in the Soviet Union, same thing in many other places I've been to. Countries, whether it be in Nigeria or in Australia or in Venezuela, I put a very important deal together. It's still
Wow. I hope you sleep well on planes. I mean, that's a
I
lot of
do,
travel.
yeah. I spend a lot of time. So I was just on a plane coming back from New York a couple of weeks ago, and the pilot came down and they took a picture with me with the pilot, and they said, on this flight today, you've reached in the core miles, 3 million miles flown on
No way.
on
You have
United.
that picture? You got to send me that picture. That's great.
3 million, yeah. So it was
Wow.
pretty wild. And they
Wow.
announced
Wow.
it on the plane. So
That's
I've been
great.
on an airplane a lot,
Whew.
but it's fun. We take advantage. I enjoy going to these trips. I enjoy going to these I love learning the culture. I wish I was better at language. Like when you asked me the question on Chinese, I learned a little Russian, but I just never, I never perfected language. It isn't
No,
something that
listen, I was in school in Israel in 1990 for a year and a half, but I was in an American environment, even though I was
yeah,
in Israel, and it didn't help me much with the
yeah,
language.
yeah.
One thing, Frank, when we first started to work together several years ago, that I found pretty interesting, just on the capital market side, is that for those listeners that don't know, typically if a company is traded on the NASDAQ, the trading symbol has 4 letters. And on New York
Yeah.
Stock Exchange, it's typically 3. And I
Yeah.
believe the process is, I mean, it's been a couple of years since I played lawyer on TV, taking companies
Yeah.
public, but you can submit an application for, I think, your first like 2 or 3 choices, and if it's available, they'll
Yeah.
give it to you. That is not the case with you. You are on the New York Stock Exchange,
Yeah.
yet have
Yeah.
4 letters. Why?
Yeah. So it's a great question because the first company I started was called Pacific Asia Petroleum, and our symbol ended up being PAP, Pacific Asia Petroleum. Then well, I like the word Pacific. So the next company was PEDEVCO, which was called Pacific Energy Development. And that symbol still today is PED.
Okay.
And so 3 letters. But with Indonesia Energy, it was another company I was involved with the IPO trio. That was 4 letters. But Indonesia Energy, 2019, we wanted to have something that sort of gave you the sense of what the name of the country. We just thought it would be easy to tell people.
Sure.
Indonesia, INDO, Indo. and you could say it. The one thing I like to do, by the way, for people doing startups is I like to have a symbol that you can say. Like it was like XYZ, you couldn't say it, right?
Ah, yeah,
But
that's an
with
interesting point.
Pacific Asia Petroleum was PAP, PAP. Pacific Energy PED, PED. And here for Indonesia Energy is INDO. So I really like the trio is trio. So I love to be able to say
That's
the
clever. No, that's clever because listen, at
yeah,
the end of the day, it's all about marketing and
yeah,
storytelling and staying top of mind presence. So doing something like that is clever.
it is.
Um,
I love it.
I definitely want to be mindful of your time. So just
Yeah,
one or two
sure.
more questions
I mean,
as we start
yeah,
to wrap up. One of the things that I'm always fascinated with or I get asked about is as a public company executive, you're seemingly running two different companies, two different lives at the same time. One is the actual business element, and then the
yeah,
other is dealing with the legal and the shareholders and the road shows and the
sure.
presentations. How
Yeah,
do you juggle both, or any
I
advice
know.
to
Yeah,
people trying to
yeah.
figure out that solution?
I mean, it's you gotta juggle all these balls, you know. So some people have difficulty with that, you know. I mean, at even at Texaco it was interesting. Even though you have these services like a secretaries that you have, I don't have a sec. We don't have secretaries too much anymore. You have assistants, but you don't have that kind of a thing. But early on, I felt that I had to do a lot of the stuff my own way. Some guy at Texaco one time said to me, early on, Frank, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't
Sure.
have fax machines at that time. We didn't have any of that stuff, emails. So we used, telex machines and cable machines. And he said to me, Frank, you got to learn how to, if it's late at night, you have to know how to go downstairs at Texaco into the communications room and send your own telex. And so it's that kind of like, and do things like that. So that's how I learned some of that stuff. I knew how to go down there and send my own telexes, and which I did sometimes. And I even helped the people in China when I had to do it in a reverse in China. So, I learned to do those things, and you got to pay attention to, these things are critical that you file on time, that you're looking at, in your startups, whether it be, people that, you always got to worry in the beginning that you don't have people that have an ability to sell shares early on and get out that are insiders, so you got to keep track of that. And but your filings on time to do your road shows, looking at those. So I kind of wore a lot of hats. Maybe I didn't delegate as much, but I just felt with a startup and a small startup, I'm not talking a multi-billion-dollar startup, but a
Right.
small startup, you got to really run all those roles. You got to be as the CEO, the guy charging forward. You got to be somewhat of also the CFO. You got to be somewhat of the chief legal officer, the tax officer. You got to be, in charge of administrative stuff. It's just something that I enjoyed doing. I was worried about anybody else missing the deadlines, so I'm on top of it all the time. So I tell people, be careful with that stuff. So we haven't missed any deadlines at Indonesia Energy. We got two great assets, one both onshore, one we're producing from on Sumatra Island, doing well. We'll be drilling a well in the next few months, another well that should really be, after we did all the seismic work, should be really helpful for the company. And then we've got this huge, I always tell people, there's one thing. In the island of Java is the main island in Indonesia. And that's where Jakarta City is, one of the largest cities in the world. And we've got an asset that's 650,000 acres. So people to get a concept of what that is, the size of the island of Manhattan is 15,000 acres. So we are 40 times the size of Manhattan. So just think of where we are. And the edge of our block, the asset we have is just 17 miles from the city of Jakarta. So we've got 4 gas discoveries that were made there. We're going to develop that asset. It's a major long-term, you know, kind of the guerrilla growth for the company going on into the future. So I'm excited about that company, excited about the future. We're not going to just stay with that. We're gonna expand in Indonesia Energy, and we're very excited about the whole.
Well, I hope that well, two things. Number one is I hope that you'll come back in a couple months
Yeah,
and give us some updates and developments.
yeah,
Number two is I strongly encourage anybody who's listening who either has an interest in oil and gas or public companies or just you've done an incredible job of being able to balance those duties as an executive
No.
and running a public company and the business at the same time. So I encourage anybody to like do some homework on Frank because there's a
Yeah.
lot to
Thank you.
learn.
Thank you.
Um, Again, the ticker symbol is
Yeah.
INDO because you could pronounce it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything
Yeah.
that you want
Yeah.
to know before we
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll just throw out there. I encourage people to follow us because whether it be through LinkedIn or through Facebook or right on our website, we're going to have a lot of changes going on. We're not going to be a static company. We've got a very evolving mission. So I'll say, we're not just an oil and gas company. We're so what Indonesia is doing in 2045, they want to become not the 10th, but the fifth largest economy in the world. And we're going to be part of that. I think it was, what's the name they call it? The Golden Indonesia 2045 is the name. But, we're part of we think of ourselves as part of a larger system that transforms energy into progress, innovation, and prosperity. Our role is to harness and direct this energy where it's needed most and to power Indonesia's future. By embracing a new definition of energy, INDO is positioning itself at the heart of Indonesia's transformation into a global economic power. As the country continues to grow, innovate, and secure its future, INDO will be there as the energy that enables this progress. So that's what I want to kind of leave. Watch us closely. We're going to be changing. We're going to be expanding our company. We're not just going to stay with the assets we are. We're going to expand the company and increase our horizon as a true energy company driving that progress in Indonesia. So Seth, this is a great opportunity to tell my
No,
story.
thank you for sharing it. I always love to learn from, people like yourself that are accomplished and, generous with their insights and time. So thank you for joining us
Thank
today.
you.
And
Thank you so much.
look forward to hearing good news in the near future.
Great. Thank you. Have a great rest of your evening, I guess, hours starting there.
Yes,
There.
you
Still
as
my
well.
afternoon here. Okay. Thanks.